And good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Terry, and I am a project coordinator for the Mountain Plains Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second session of the series Preventing and Responding to Family Violence During COVID-19. Today's presentation is being provided by the Mountain Plains MHTTC and the MHTTC Network Coordinating Office in partnership with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The MHTTC network accelerates the adoption and implementation of mental health-related evidence-based practices across the nation. The MHTTC works to develop and disseminate resources, provide free local and regional training and technical assistance, and heighten the awareness, knowledge, and skills of the mental health workforce. The MHTTC network is comprised of 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Here's a map showing the different regional centers that serve the HHS regions and the nations, and we encourage you to connect with the center that is in your region. As we noted, this is session 2 of our 4-part series on preventing and responding to family violence during COVID-19. The next session in this series is next Tuesday, July 28th from noon to 1 Central Time. And we'll be sharing information for where you can go to register for the upcoming sessions in this series in the chat box. Today's presentation is provided free of charge by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. Today's presentation is available in the public domain and should not be distributed for a fee without the express written permission of the MHTTC network. The views and opinions expressed during today's presentation are those of our presenters and panelists and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA is intended or should be inferred. And please contact us with any questions you may have about this. So, welcome to our training, Keeping It in the Family, Addressing Family Conflict in the Time of COVID-19. It is my pleasure to introduce our trainers for today's session. Dr. Laurel Kaiser is with the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Medicine. She is a psychologist working in the field for over 40 years. She leads the Family Informed Trauma Treatment Center, a Category 2 center in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Along with a dedicated team of clinicians and families, she developed Strengthening Family Coping Resources, an intervention designed specifically for families coping with chronic and severe stress and trauma. And she is joined today by Vicki Rampala, who is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years of social work practice and management experience. She has been an affiliate of the NCTSN since 2011 and is the former chair of the NTCSN Partnering with Youth and Families Committee from 2007 to 2011. And it's my pleasure to turn things over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, David. We've been starting our presentations with like 30 seconds of mindfulness to help us get grounded and to really help support our presence in it. So if you could take a moment and put your feet on the floor. If you want to keep your eyes open or if you want to close them, that's fine. I'm going to read a poem to help us get centered before we get into the presentation. Take away the clutter, take away the pain, step into the moment, enjoy the soft refrain. Perhaps you'll find silence or music's soft repose as you touch your inner feelings and so your presence grows. In truth, it is but a moment, but aren't they all just that? A focused appreciation of where we are now at. You need not journey further than just inside your mind, the wonders that await you in the presence you'll find. Thank you. If you want to go on to the next slide, we're going to move into the presentation. So today, what we plan to be talking about is learning, assessment, and safety considerations in the time of self-isolation and quarantine, and gaining tools and skills to use with families to build protective skills and resources in the time of thinking about families and violence and conflict. So if you can go to the next slide. Just to level set everybody around sort of the definitions that we're talking about here, intimate partner violence occurs when an individual purposely causes harm or threatens the risk of harm to any past or current partner or spouse. Children can be impacted by intimate partner violence through direct injury or witnessing the harm. Physical abuse happens when a caregiver commits an act that results in physical injury, even if the injury was unintentional. And child neglect often occurs when a caregiver does not meet a child's needs. One of the things that I've raised when defining this is that oftentimes people assume that when someone is in a domestic violence or intimate partner violence relationship, that the child is unable to be protected and that they often need to be removed. I think we've learned a lot over the last 5 to 10 years about the fact that there are a lot of safety provisions in place that parents are able to do to keep the children safe in the context of family violence. That really needs to be part of the picture in considering keeping it in the family, but also addressing sort of child safety related needs. So the impacts that we've seen over time is that without treatment or intervention, children who are exposed to family violence can have the following: emotional upset, depressive symptoms, behavior changes, difficulties with self-regulation, problems with attachment, physical symptoms, nightmares, and risky behaviors. Next slide. So some of the elements of treatment and intervention that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but also just in general that have been helpful around addressing these witnessing or experiencing family violence, is having evidence-based informed treatment, understanding traumatic stress responses in whatever setting you're in, including being able to pay attention and be aware of what might be triggering the child in whatever setting they're in based on their history, and really providing that unconditional positive support and regard. And then mitigating risk factors and building protective factors. Those are a big part of what we're trying to do always, is knowing that while violence may be predictable or unpredictable, that there are ways we can continue to build protective factors for children and families that are responsive to their needs too. Next slide. So when we think about intimate partner violence and family violence in general, we know that there are several circles in the ecology of the family violence and the systems involved, particularly for the individual who's involved in it. There could be histories of substance use, trauma exposure, even connection to a spiritual or religious faith on an individual level. In the relationship, there's all kinds of risk and protective factors that play a role in sort of the impact of domestic violence or family violence on that system, but also in that relationship too, including economic stress and food insecurity, connection to school, having family members or supports, including stresses that we've seen more recently with COVID around that relationship. And then thinking about the community level of ecology that affects family systems. We know that community support and connectedness are big parts of what helps and supports in the context of intimate partner violence and family violence, but also where the structural inequities across the systems play a role in the difficulties that may exist in sort of getting support from the outside too. So we're gonna talk about a case that we're gonna apply this lens to, and I'm gonna ask a couple questions when we get to that in just a moment. But thinking about the case in terms of the individual, the relationship, and the community will be really important to really think about sort of where are the risk and protective factors that may play a role in this family circumstance too. So next slide. Jennifer is living with her partner and they have 4 children. She is undocumented and her partner is an American citizen. Her children are 12, 10, 5, and 3 years old. Her parents have been the child care resources in the past, but she has not been able to have them care for the children because of worries with COVID-19. She lost her job recently because of COVID-19 and because she had no child care when schools went to remote learning. Her boyfriend has been working, but work has been more stressful than usual, and he comes home from work stressed and ends up drinking too much. He's been yelling at Jennifer about how lazy and unmotivated she is because the house is not perfect when he comes home. And last week, he locked the children and Jennifer out of the kitchen and their food when he went to work. He's been restricting any access to money when he's at work and has been tracking her cell phone use as he pays the phone bills. The 12-year-old is not keeping up with schoolwork and yelling at Jennifer when she tries to help him. And the 3-year-old is not sleeping well at night and comes into bed with Jennifer and a partner most nights, creating additional tension. So in thinking about this case example and the ecology we just presented, what are some risk and protective factors that you've seen in families you work with, or this particular case, that may play a role in helping to mitigate the concerns in this particular family, but also that may be risks for this family too? You can put it in the chat. Undocumented, right. What are other risk or protective factors? Financial instability, substance use, right? No childcare, high stress, drinking, multiple stressors, loss of childcare, hunger, no money, no family support, verbal abuse from partner, 4 children, isolated, lack of resources. She has her children, not sleeping well, verbal and emotional abuse, lack of sleep, cultural gender roles, taking on the role of educator. We're seeing lots of them. Thank you so much for all of this input. I think this is clear that we're seeing lots of risk factors that play a role in this family's ability to cope in the context of COVID and the additional stressors that come with the context of COVID too. Thank you so much. Can we go on to the next slide? So one of the ways that we've really considered thinking about this is how we support families with our model called Strengthening Family Coping Resources. There's 2 different models that we've been talking about. We'll talk about a little bit here, just to give you an overview, but mostly what we're going to be talking about the skills that we learn in the context of the group, and also the ways that we support families in building protective factors to help cope with the stressors that we just mentioned. So we're going to be weaving Jennifer's story into the slides that follow and sort of how we think about this family and the ways we can build those protective factors. But I think this gives you an overview of sort of what a multifamily group model looks like, and then what a peer-to-peer model looks like, and how we've really begun to address support for the caregivers themselves through a peer-to-peer model, but also the whole family and the family system in considering the multifamily group. Next slide. So a big part of what we talk about are the six healing resources that we know are most important in building skills in families that are protective factors, that our families need to be considering co-regulation and crisis management, having deliberateness in their structure and routines, having structure in their lives, having a sense of connectedness in their internal and external resources, that they have resource-seeking behaviors, and that they can create positive affect, memories, and meaning from the experiences in their life day to day. Next slide. So when we think about mitigating risk and factors and building upon protective factors, these are the key areas that we've considered in thinking about COVID-19 that we have really named in a lot of our work that we've done, which is the disrupted routines and structure. Thinking about Jennifer, like she wasn't able to go to work because she had to be home to take care of the children because they couldn't be watched by her parents. So we're building coping resources to address establishing order and regularity in their family life, the preventive routines that allow for a degree of control when there's uncontrollable situations are what we're trying to do when there's disrupted routines. And really the idea of collaborative coping and interdependence in family members. What we know is that families are systems and they all work hand in hand, that one individual doesn't exist in isolation in a family, but how a family adjusts and copes is really how each member in the family adjusts and copes. And really having that enjoyment of shared experiences that happen over time when there's disrupted routines and structure, and building that back in. Certainly with family violence, we consider the heightened safety concerns and where there's a need for establishing rules and limits, defining safety plans within families, rapid stabilization of family functioning, attunement and communication of safety needs, particularly around parents and children and sort of what the plans are related to those, including boundaries and where we create family comfort zones during those interactions that help establish sort of where people feel safe in the household, and being able to read each other's cues and listen to each other in the context of the stress and strain that might be going on, including building stress reduction skills. And then more often what we've seen particularly with people who live in intergenerational homes, is the crowding and isolation that happens during COVID, and with having everyone be at home and not being able to leave the home at times when we've been on quarantine in our communities, and really helping the family identify who they can rely on, ask for and accept assistance when they need, giving to others when the opportunity arises, and even thinking about their spiritual beliefs and gratitude in the context of those risks around crowding and isolation. Next slide. So what we also want to emphasize is that safety is not just the removal of threat. A big part of it is built on our autonomic system and how we respond in relation to each other, but to cues that are given. So there might be a deliberate process around writing down or creating safety plans, but it's also about how parents are attuned to their children, how family members are attuned to each other, and how it can trigger feelings of safety or danger or life threat. Whether or not they exist in reality is not always the case when people feel safe or not safe. Trauma can disrupt that sense of safety and shift the autonomic state and really affect our internal system in a way that creates triggers and reactions that may be over or underreacting to situations because of how their internal state has become habituated to those responses too. Next slide. So the features of safety and danger in our life threat is the really understanding the importance of our face-to-face interactions, how we talk to each other, how our body posture is, and our gestures. And when we think about a parent and a child, really just the cues of safety or danger. So I think about the 3-year-old who's getting into bed with Jennifer at night, sort of thinking about what's going on for that 3-year-old and how to help that 3-year-old feel safe, and really understanding their little person understanding of that world, but also vocalizing, I'm going to keep you safe. Let's help create a bedtime routine to help really work on you feeling safe and are able to stay in your bed, and being able to speak to it in a way that a child can hear it, but also where a parent is regulated in their response too. So it's a really this interplay of the parent and the child that creates that co-regulation experience, but also where that felt experience of safety occurs between the parent and child themselves. Next slide. So we also talk about safety triggers during that face-to-face social engagement. So sort of how the facial expression and gaze occurs, the vocalizations, and how a person listens, and really understanding that reciprocity happens through that attunement together and how the response happens in relation to each other over time too. So I think I'm passing it on to Laurel at this point, who's going to take it from here and talk about how we apply what we just learned in thinking about skill.
Thanks, Vicki. Good afternoon and morning, everybody. Happy to be here. And we're going to talk a little bit about the way we have looked at using strengthening family coping resources in telehealth. And it's much more difficult to run groups right now. In fact, most places have stopped running group therapy processes, and SFCR, or Strengthening Family Coping Resources, is mainly run as either a parent group or multifamily groups. And we have now successfully transitioned both to a telehealth platform and have experience doing that. And we're going to show you some of the activities that we use in SFCR that can help address some of the things that families are dealing with. So one of the activities we do, or sessions we do in both the peer-to-peer group as well as the multifamily group, is to look at family schedules. Many times when families are under a whole lot of stress, the family schedule becomes much more chaotic. And we think this is especially true with all the disruptions that have occurred due to COVID, that family daily life has become much more stressful, and in many ways for many families much more chaotic when the routines of going to school, going to work, coming home have been disrupted, as well as the regular routines of going shopping or going out and having play dates or visiting with friends. So with all that disrupted, family daily schedules have become pretty chaotic. We start out by asking parents and other family members to keep a diary or a journal of their daily routines and to think about what times of days are more stressful than others. And then we have the families come together in a group way, or the parents come together and list their routines on a poster. This is a picture of when we do that live. We also used a very similar format doing this on a telehealth platform using Zoom and having the families call out their routines, and we wrote them in under the times of days. For Jennifer and her family, helping them look at their daily routine and what times of days are working and not working for their family was a very helpful activity, and help them look at both the uncertainty and lack of predictability that was happening in their family life right now with so many of their daily routines disrupted. With the boyfriend being the only one who had a work schedule at this point, we also looked at what his work schedule, how that was interwoven with the family's daily routines, and how we might structure things so that when he was at work, certain routines were taking place, and then when he came home, the family could switch and do different routines that would help reduce stress in the family and help improve the family's shared time together with more pleasant activities and time spent together. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Next slide, please. A couple of the daily routines that we pay a lot of attention to are shared family meals, which we know are have been shown to be great protective factors for families. The more frequently a family can share a meal together, the better off their mental health is, the better their academic performance is for the kids, the better family well-being is. So there are a lot of ways that shared family meals really can improve family functioning. And we really encourage families to share. In our multifamily group, each group starts with a family meal. And we were able to reproduce that in our telehealth model in a way that I think was very supportive for the families. So we actually had food delivered for each family for mealtime, and then we broke out into family breakout rooms so the families could share their meals together. We introduced some activities during the meals that the families can use to engage in sharing and pleasant conversation, with some give and take and some help with modulating regulation and making sure that meal times don't devolve into chaos and really trying to have conflict or problem-solving conversations. So we really work with the families to do this. And this again was helpful for Jennifer's family. If they could come home, if the boyfriend could come home and the family could start the evening with a shared family meal, that was a good way to help them structure the evening in a way that felt healthier and less conflictual to the family. Next slide. We also work a lot on bedtimes. We know when people get stressed that sleep problems can become a major issue for families. So we really work on regular bedtimes and structured nighttime activities that lead to bedtimes. We also know that with disruptions in daily schedules, especially for the young children, especially for like the 3-year-old who was used to spending the day with grandparents and may have had a structured nap time, that the loss of those routines might also impact sleep. And so we really worked with Jennifer and her boyfriend to create some structured nighttime activities, especially for the 3-year-old, and set a bedtime, even if the other children in the household were not ready for bed or going to sleep, so that we could try and help them get her sleep better, her sleep better regulated, so that she might sleep through the night and stay in her own bed. Another way to decrease stress in the family partnership. Next slide. For families and where there's concerns about boundaries and safeties, setting limits is a major way to help them decide on ways and develop plans for keeping their family safe. And we use a fence metaphor with the families to talk about how to set boundaries and limits, and how boundaries and limits are used to keep family members safe. In times of COVID, there are a multitude of safety issues that the families are dealing with. And in Jennifer's family, there are additional safety concerns for the family, including some of the boyfriends threatening or restrictive behaviors that are really designed to keep Jennifer and the family in check. And so helping this family set appropriate boundaries around some of the risk factors for the family. And this could include for the youngest child sleeping in her own bed, which could be a boundary. But it also could include, you know, the family talking through some of the boundaries that have been set around privacy, around money issues, and helping them work through some of those boundaries so that everyone in the family feels safer. They also could be limits around the way the kids interact with parents, such as, you know, the 12-year-old yelling and becoming verbally angry with Jennifer while she's helping, and setting boundaries around those types of communication might be helpful in the family, and help everybody in the family role model some safer ways of interacting with each other. Next slide. We also know that one of the issues in COVID, and especially for Jennifer and her family, was the loss of some of her support system. And so one of the activities we use in SFCR to help families think about their support system, especially when things get stressful, is to do a sociogram. And then we follow up with some discussion of where are your supports that are helpful right now? Where have you lost supports? Which supports can you keep up with in COVID and how during COVID, and how might you do that safely? Are there some people that you're able to provide support for? So is there reciprocity in your system, and how might you be doing that so that Jennifer and her family can feel positive about that? I think also during COVID, it's important for families to think about the supports that their children typically get, which may have been lost. So what are the supports that the 12-year-old, the 10-year-old have now not had, that now not have and how can their access to those supports, like teachers or coaches or even friends, how can those be supported during COVID so that for the kids, the support systems are still in place? So really helping families think through this and understand how to maintain these support systems in a safe and healthy way became something that we help the families work on and pay attention to throughout the family system, not just for one person. Using telehealth and with our multifamily group, one of the things that we did and which Jennifer appreciated was at kind of the midpoint in our sessions, after a couple of sessions and the families got to know each other, we created a family phone tree so that the families were calling each other in between our weekly sessions. And Jennifer, as well as some of the other families, really felt this as a way to build support and noted that even if they didn't know each other very well, that they were kind of surprised at how much they looked forward to those calls, but also felt good making those calls where they could offer support, where they could share resources. So it became a nice way to build community within the multifamily group network that we were forming. And this was also a call that Jennifer felt was a legitimate call that she could make, and so she didn't feel concerned about making this call and her boyfriend paying attention to it. Next slide. We talk a lot about things that get in the way, what happens in life or in daily existence that really throws us off our daily routines, our schedules, even our practice of family rituals and traditions. What are the kinds of things that happen that stop us from being deliberate about the way we go about our daily lives? And so we ask the families to do skits and to play out a time when something gets in the way of an activity that the family has planned. And this is an example of one of the skit cards that we ask the families to do. In our multifamily group, we did send each family a hard copy as well as a text with their skit on it. We broke the families up into breakout rooms to practice their skits for a couple minutes. And then we had the families come back and perform their skits for the other families and let the other families guess what got in the way. For this particular family, for Jennifer and her family, this would not particularly be the skit card that we would give Jennifer and her family, because it might be so close to what actually happens in their family that it might be triggering. So we would look for a different skit card, but this gives you an idea of one of the activities. And then the families can really talk about what has gotten in the way from their ability to carry out daily routines and family processes in a way that is helpful. For Jennifer, it is often, and her family, it was often the tension with her partner that was kind of also becoming evident with her kids in the way they interacted with each other, would often pull them away from from sharing more pleasant activities together or times together. Next slide. We also think about spirituality as a way to help families understand the meaning of what's happening in their lives, and also talk with their kids about why things happen, and how we can stay connected with not only with ourselves, but with something greater than ourselves in many ways. And this has been really important for families during COVID. It also, many families talk about their spirituality and their religious practices at the same time, and with the disruptions in ability to attend church gatherings and things like that, church or temple, that many families who really use that as a support system have also been really missing that support. So we felt like it was important to help them stay in touch with their spirituality, and also to use it to help them make meaning of COVID and what's happening during COVID, and how people are behaving and what their values are during this very stressful time in the world. We usually have the families make a spirituality word flower. This is an activity that came from a group process around spirituality. It's not an activity that's primary to SFCR. We were able to do this online as well. We built a PowerPoint with a family, with a flower, and the families each read out words that denoted their sense of spirituality, and then had a wonderful discussion about how important spirituality was. And Jennifer and her family were also able to talk about their spirituality and their ability to use that to support them, and also to support their staying connected with a community from their church that has been very helpful in supporting Jennifer, and is also acceptable to her, doesn't cause, I don't mean acceptable, does not cause tension in her relationship. And so she has also identified people from her church that she can stay in touch with. Next slide. Fun and laughter is an important part of family well-being, and it's also an important antidote to a lot of stress. So we do a lot of activities with the families where we can introduce laughter, and helping families find a time where they can do something that feels good and that creates laughter, helps them create some shared time where they're creating positive memories. And we really had families talking about how to make this time during COVID a special time, and how to structure family activities where there was lots of laughter, positive memories, so that when this became part of the family's scrapbook or memory bank, they saw it as a time when the family was not only very stressed, but also when there was a time to build positive relationships and to build positive memories. And many of the families talked about really treasuring that time and really finding that important ways to use this time, and to also cope with the things that were happening in their family. Next slide. Finally, the transition from, face-to-face, our work is always stressful, but we also found that the transition from live groups to telehealth was very stressful. And we really wanted to focus on how the team that was working with these families, both the peers and the clinicians were experiencing this change, their own stress at work, doing telehealth sessions in their home when their own children were around, and how that could be stressful and cause some stress. And so we did spend some time with the facilitators working through that and acknowledging secondary traumatic stress and self-care. And so now I think we're going to turn to a question and answer period. So I'll turn that over to the group.
Great. Thank you so much, Laurel and Vicki. This was a really great presentation. I'm going to turn things over to Thomasine Heitkamp, who is the co-director of the Mountain Plains MHTTC, to facilitate our Q&A.
I echo David's remarks. What a helpful presentation. And as I look in the question and answer box, people are really taking a deep dive into how this works in terms of how you work with the cards, how you work with the kits, and the nice interaction in the family. So congratulations. One of the questions involves activities that you might be using during mealtime. I like how you described that you delivered food, but you mentioned you didn't want that to turn into chaos. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you prevent that?
Yeah, I can take that one, Vicki, and then you can chime in. We do talk to the families about what is important in terms of not only the frequency with which they eat meals together, but also some of the things that they can do to make mealtime healthy, like limiting distractions. Asking people to put down devices, asking them to not take phone calls, having a regular meal time that is structured, keeping it fairly short, especially in a household like Jennifer's, where there's a 3-year-old and a 12-year-old. You're not talking about an hour-long family meal where you expect the kids to sit quietly at the table and share. We also introduce cards called conversation prompts that really just ask very simple questions. We even have a set of conversation prompts that's really just pictures that a 3-year-old can look at and either describe what's on the card or ask a question about what's on the card to the rest of the family. And the families really enjoy taking turns going through these cards and having a pleasant give and take kind of conversation. And none of the cards get into anything really serious, but they help the families do the things that are important to be done at meal times, like talking about what has to be done that evening, something that happened to somebody that day, or talking about what one of the kids learned in school or something that happened online that day. So they just are a nice way for the family to share experiences.
And the only other thing I would just add to that is that some families who are not used to having meals together, I think the structure of the group has been helpful. Having facilitators who pop in, for us when we did it virtually, to pop into the room during the meal time, again, reinforcing parent is in charge and really wanting to encourage the parent to take the lead, but also to help encourage the conversation. If they're not used to doing that, it takes a couple times before they start using the meal time in the way that would be helpful for them to really enjoy it and get the most out of it. And so that's a big part of what we try to do in person, but also which we recreated virtually too.
Thanks, great response. There's another question about groups. How can we deal with a family member who is creating violence, who is either not willing or feels too threatened to join the group with, especially during social distancing, quarantine, when they can't be encouraged to come out into the community. You want to talk a little bit about that? Laurel?
Yeah, we can talk about that. And this is a conversation that we have as our facilitator teams, both clinically, both when we're doing group in person and certainly when we're doing it online. Where, and one of the things that we tried to do in the very beginning of group, which was something that was really, that some experts in telepsychiatry really encouraged us to do, was to set some guidelines about participation in group that included like how people were going to present themselves on the video screen. Who was going to be there? How are they going to be dressed? Things like drinking while in group, having a beer can or a drink, using drugs while in group, smoking while in group. All of those things were things we kind of talked about and set some boundaries and some guidelines. And families were encouraged to invite everybody who was in the home to participate in the group. There are times when certainly someone is not willing to participate in group because they feel like they're going to be picked on. Oftentimes, though, they want to join the family meal and participate in the family meal. So that was one way that we tried to engage everybody in the family. We also do spend some time talking about whether perpetrators of violence, especially domestic violence in families, are included in multifamily group or parent groups. And often we actually find it very helpful because they can sometimes say things to each other or hear things from each other that they are not able to hear from, from a therapist or from a counselor of some kind, or even from a friend or another family member. So sometimes other people in group can really point out, sounds like that behavior is pretty abusive to your family and is causing your family to be scared of you. And they can sometimes hear that in a different way from another family member than they can hear from a clinician.
And I would say one of the things that we've looked at is sort of how the domestic violence criminalization has led to a greater propensity for that kind of response when family conflict occurs. And I think there's a continuum that exists, and not to dispel the physical violence that could lead to people having lethality concerns that we worry about them shooting another person, right? Like we take that into consideration, but I think there's all this gray area. And when we have children involved, they're witnessing it, they're seeing it, they're hearing it, they know about it. It's not like it doesn't exist. And so where we create a platform that's safe for families to be able to name things is also when they begin to heal, right? And oftentimes what we realize is that somebody who may be a perpetrator may have had their own history of trauma, and that this just helps them move further along to say, wow, this is like something that happened to me that I really don't want my kids to be frightened of me. I think a lot of what we've learned in the perpetrator side of the world is that they're not really perpetrators, they're victims too. And that oftentimes they come from a circumstance where they've been hurt themselves. And so helping them to tap into that is also how a family begins to heal and stop that intergenerational transmission and really help the kids move into some meaning making for their own future.
Thank you. I'm really struck by how you're using this time of social distancing to build family structures because they're together. Another question, and this is from Jesse. I really like the setting limits and using the fence system. Can you give examples of how you would start this conversation? So again, a deep dive. How do you start that conversation? We'll start with Vicki.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it? I was looking at the chat for a moment.
That's okay. How do you really start the fence system? Give examples of how you start the conversation when you're using the fence system.
Well, I think the great thing about the physicality of doing it is that a family can do it together in a way that they can create the fence however they want in whatever sort of structure. It doesn't have to be a rectangle, it doesn't have to be a square. And I think the act of doing it together is also beginning sort of the physical movement of making these decisions together, where the mother or the parent who's involved in the group can really help sort of say that we're in this together, we're collaborating around this process of making successful decisions as a family and moving our family in a way that we get along and do things well, but also where I think it adds to everyone's participating in adding what they want limits around in the center of the fence, which is really where we begin to talk about limit setting, is that, you know, parents set some of the tone of sort of where they see the limits that need to be set, but kids can also add to it. And so doing it in a physical way, kinesthetically, also helps every family member feel like their participation is valued in that process.
So I guess if it wasn't clear, in the face-to-face group, we actually hand each family a toy fence kit. And the first thing that they do is build their fence together. And usually the fences have gates and, you know, so they can put that in. And then we use that fence, once it's built, to talk metaphorically about how family limits can help contain danger and threats within the family, and how if we're working together inside that fence, we can all stay safe. And so that's how we start the conversation about safety. In the telehealth group, we did not send every family a toy fence, but what we did was send them a handout with a fence on it and spaces to write their top 3 limits that were related to their safety. And so they had to kind of talk through what are family limits, and then in addition to that, they talk about and family limits are for everybody in the family. They're just not, they're not like rules. They're, you know, what do we do as a family to stay safe? So that could even be talking about, you know, how to limit exposure to COVID when when Jennifer's partner would go to work. Like, what are the family limits on that? How does the 12-year-old still be able to go out and see friends and have some freedoms, but maintain the limits within the family to be able to protect them from exposure?
Thanks, Laurel. Another bit of a theme that's coming out in the Q&A is some suggestions on what might occur after these sessions in families. Michael writes, I'm much less concerned about what happens in group than an escalation of violence after groups because sensitive information is shared. This is a well-known standard of practice for therapy with intimate partner violence. Can you address that question? And it is a little bit of a theme in the Q&A box.
Do you want to start?
So I think this is an issue that you know, you have to deal with whenever you're dealing with family violence, either in a face-to-face setting or on, you know, in a telehealth setting. You have to be able to talk about that. And that often is part of closing out the group, is checking in with the families and having a ritual that we use to close the group, to kind of de-escalate any tension, to have the families leaving in a good space. but also setting up any of the, emergency kind of processes that you would have set up with any family. Even having, if family violence is a major issue, setting up some signs or signals that families can use, can show online if they're not feeling safe. And then the facilitators can check back in immediately after group, or they can, if it's the SOS signal, they can send help to the home. The same thing you would do, in-person groups. If you're getting those kind of cues from a family, you wouldn't send them home from group. You would put in place other processes. So you do the same kinds of things. And we also have frequent check-ins with the families that multiple people from the group setting were checking in with the families over the week.
And I would also just add that in the initial assessment with families, like any other initial assessment, you're also seeing their ability to participate in the group and sort of what level of safety or considerations are part of that picture, and whether or not it makes sense for it to happen. So you would do the safety planning, safety assessment, lethality assessment from the beginning to say, is this a safe option for this family to participate? And also here's a safety planning process that we would put in place when you participate, if you participate. But we would also work with the family to say, this group might not be the right place for you right now. It feels like there's a lot of escalation that's happening very frequently. There's been threat of harm, there's access to guns, there's all the lethality concerns that we have around domestic violence that we worry would escalate. And we would give those alternatives that we think would be most appropriate for that family at that time. So.
Thanks, Vicki and Laurel. And I hope you're seeing some of the positive comments in the chat box. This is very helpful, and the specific information you provided, I know the 700 people who logged in today are going to take some of these skills and talents away, the ability to implement some of what you're doing very creatively and cleverly. So congratulations to you on behalf of the Mountain Plains Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We were pleased to host this with you today.